Welcome to today's New England Hymns webinar presented by premier sponsor Connection, titled Managed Services in Healthcare IT, presented by Chance Mixon, Business Development Manager, Lifecycle Services with Connection. As a former healthcare IT leader with a large healthcare IDN, Chance Mixon has more than 13 years of experience delivering managed services across the continuum of care. In his current role, Chance works with healthcare providers who leverage Connection's managed services to help extend reach and improve overall healthcare IT efficiencies. All lines have been muted upon entry today, so please send your questions via the Q&A feature and Chance will answer them at the end of the session. Please join me in welcoming Chance today.
Thanks very much, everybody. We appreciate being able to spend time with you this afternoon and perhaps share some additional information about managed services and how it could be beneficial to use if that's not something that you're already involved in. Just by way of telling you a little bit about myself, besides what was in the introduction, I guess what I like to think is that I spent a fair amount of time on the side of the desk where you are. So in corporate IT, inside healthcare. So I do understand a lot of the pressures that come to bear. I've been with small hospital systems. I've been with very large hospital systems. And so I have some unique understanding. I've got a special place in my heart for healthcare IT folks. So that's sort of the place that I'm coming from in the presentation that I'm making today. What we're going to try to accomplish this afternoon is to talk generally about what the benefits of using managed services are. And we'll talk about some things that maybe you've heard about managed services that are not always true. There's some things that might keep you from using managed services that maybe have changed since you last considered using managed services. And we'll talk about how some of the benefits where managed services can optimize spend. Is it possible to gain more effective use of healthcare IT budgets where it comes to spend by using managed services? You know, the formula has always been that managed services are supposed to save money, but does it optimize spend? Are there additional financial benefits to using a managed services organization as opposed to an internal one? One of the problems that many IT departments are facing, and healthcare is no exception, is turnover and retaining staff. It's competitive to keep skilled resources in place. So does managed services, do they reduce turnover, and can they improve IT staff retention? We'll be talking about that as well. So let's get right into our material. First of all, we'll get into section 1, just talking about managed services. And could be that many of you are familiar with managed services and maybe even use some managed services in your organization. But where it comes to healthcare IT, there are several key managed services that typically are found in healthcare organizations. Network management is an area where managed services are typically found, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that as we get further into our discussion this afternoon. But there are specific reasons to have network management, also cybersecurity as a managed service, as opposed to attempting to manage that internally. Managing an EMR system, there are managed services for that. And so there can be benefits to using EMR system management, managed services in place, as well as clinical systems. Besides EMR, I know with some of the hospital systems I worked with, there were hundreds and hundreds of systems that were ancillary to the EMR system. So having the ability to have managed services take over some of that work can be beneficial. Managing medical imaging equipment and service desk can also be some of the managed services that are found in healthcare IT and that can be beneficial in using those in healthcare IT. But what are the challenges that healthcare IT are facing? You know, Connection does work with a wide variety of healthcare organizations. And some of the things that we've noted that are unique challenges that are faced by healthcare IT departments are ensuring that sensitive patient data is secure and it's private and that it's not going to be encrypted by some bad actor for a ransom. Also, managing the interconnection between EMR systems. So I know the hospital systems that I was with, there was a very complex integration between systems, clinical and EMR systems in particular, that had to be in place and it had to be working properly. And many times it needed to be real time. There couldn't be delays in processing transactions between systems. Regulatory compliance is a challenge that only gets more complex as we go along, as more regulations are put in place to try to deal with issues that come up. Regulatory compliance becomes more and more of an issue to try to manage. And with limited staff, it can be sometimes overwhelming to deal with those regulatory compliance standards. As medical technology advances rapidly and IT infrastructure evolves, then it's a challenge to keep up with it. If you're using an all internal IT staff, and maybe you're with a hospital system that is not very large, maybe it's a smaller hospital system, then it can be tough to keep up just after the workload, trying to keep up with what the new trends are, what applies, how is the infrastructure going to scale to deal with the volume of the business, the healthcare organization in a year, in 5 years. All of those things can be difficult to wrap arms around. And then finally, we talked about security and privacy. Well, it would be secure to shut everything off and not have anybody able to access anything. That would be secure, but it doesn't help the operation to function. So there has to be some balance for accessibility with data security. Another challenge in the landscape of healthcare IT is reliability. We talked about compliance, but reliability of the infrastructure is crucial, and it can be very difficult to maintain. It's not something that used to be years and years ago, 10, 15 years ago. It wasn't quite as difficult to design an infrastructure and design an application stack that was fairly reliable, that didn't have to worry about a lot of outages going on. But now, making sure that patient records are always accessible and critical healthcare systems are always accessible, and making sure that there are not issues with those systems. I know that when I was an IT director with a couple of hospital systems, the worst thing that I could hear is that a hospital system had gone to downtime procedures. That just made me cringe, because somebody had educated me when I first started working in healthcare. I got educated on what that means to be on downtime procedures. Things like runners running from the lab to the ED, and all sorts of manual procedures going on that the delay could threaten people's lives. And so it was important to keep things reliable. And finally, something that's a benefit of keeping compliance and reliability is that it fosters trust. You need not only the healthcare providers in the hospital systems and regulatory bodies, but patients need to be able to trust that the hospital system, what they do with the information that they have, is secure, and that they're not going to have to worry that their information might get out into the public someplace. So those are two of the main items that we find in the landscape today for healthcare IT. We said that we would talk a little bit about the benefits of managed services, and really what we're going through here, some of this information may be familiar to you. You may pick up additional information that you hadn't heard before, or the managed service conversation may be relatively new. It may be something that you have an all internal IT staff, and you hadn't really thought about whether managed services was something that is worth considering. Maybe you've heard terrible things about managed services, and there are some legitimate reasons why those things come up, but they're one-offs. They're not generally an issue. So let's talk a little bit about specialized expertise. So when I was running an IT systems integration, systems engineering group, in the smaller hospital systems that I was in, we maybe had 5 or 6 people that were running that infrastructure platform. And then we had other folks that were managing the applications. And so we could only have so much expertise in the organization. It really was not possible for us to have subject matter experts on some of the key technologies that we had. We had sort of middle of the road expertise on those systems. And one of the benefits of using a managed service provider to take on part or most of workload where it comes to these different managed services areas is that the managed service providers have experts that have specialized skill sets. So just imagine a leveraged group of several hundred people where there's 2 or 3 specialists in each subject matter area. So they may not be working on your particular management of your systems all the time, but when an issue comes up and the frontline engineers are having difficulty dealing with it, or a question comes up about planning or about how to move forward with some of the products, then having a managed service provider means that there is somebody in that organization that can answer a question or that can solve a problem that may not be able to be solved by internal folks. You may know this, for instance, in the case of using Microsoft support, and some of the Microsoft support that you can engage lets you have that extra level of escalation where you can go to somebody from Microsoft to help solve a problem that you typically might not be able to deal with internally. You can search the knowledge base all you want. It's not going to give you the answer to the question. So those in-house experts that managed services providers give you, they have in-depth knowledge, they've got experience, they've been working in hundreds of environments typically, and they're working across multiple industries. But most of the managed services providers have healthcare expertise, and in some cases they've specialized vertically. So they have a specific practice that's just for healthcare, and the managed services that they provide are specialized to healthcare. So that's a real benefit to using managed services, is having that specialized expertise that really what it does is it virtually expands your team such that they can cover a lot more ground. Now, something that I would mention here before we get further into the discussion is that when I first started working in healthcare IT, a lot of times managed service providers were all or nothing kind of propositions and services. So, for instance, if you're going to have a managed service provider manage your network, it was an all or nothing proposition. Either they managed the entire network or they managed nothing. And it was a black box. So you could only send requests to that group or escalate issues to that group. You had no control over what was going on in that environment except by submitting requests and discussing it with the managed service provider, because they were going to lay down their standard template across that and manage it the way that they managed everybody else. The managed services providers have come a long way where it comes to being flexible with services that people are consuming. So as an example, a network service provider or a security service provider might work along with your internal staff to handle, for instance, block and tackle kind of operations for you, routine things that need to happen, but you might handle project-based work. And so each entity can make changes in the environment using the same change control process and the change approval process. But the whole black box idea or all or nothing proposition, that really has gone from managed services providers for the most part. There are a few monolithic providers that are still out there, but most are flexible. So if you decide to talk with somebody who's providing managed services, you can typically discuss with them what it is. And we'll talk more about this as we get into the discussion, but you can talk with them about what it is that you want to put out to them to have them manage versus what you want to manage internally. And like I said, we'll talk about that in more detail as we go on. Something else that's a real benefit of using managed services is access to advanced technology. We talked a minute ago about how that it can be difficult to stay ahead of technological trends and products where they may infrastructure or application products that may provide additional scale. It might provide additional cost savings or efficiencies or performance. Staying ahead of those things can be difficult when you're in the firefight all the time, when you're dealing with availability issues, when you're just trying to keep the shop running from day to day. It can be difficult, but managed service providers spend time investing in cutting edge technology. They can work on and can incorporate products and services that may be cost prohibitive if you're trying to do it as a single organization. So they can even provide just some advice based on practical knowledge that's not theoretical, but they can say, we use that technology with some of these clients. This is how it works. These are the benefits that we've seen. Here are some gotchas that we've seen. They can come to the table with all of that information. And that generally is just part of the managed service that's provided for them to provide that kind of advice and to provide assistance in implementing that technology where it's required or where you think that it's going to be something that benefits you. Even where it comes to practices, not just technologies or applications, but where it comes to how to manage an infrastructure, what are the latest innovations, what are the best practices, those advanced technologies are available such that the MSP, the managed service provider, can give advice as to here's how it's currently being done, or they may even have an observation about how it's implemented today. Even if they are managing your environment, you'll find that managed service providers come along and say, we're looking to evolve this service to another level, and this is how we want to do it. And they can help plan that and work with you so that they can evolve your organization to a different level that becomes more efficient and typically can save costs and or avoid regulatory issues and compliance issues. Something else that's a real benefit to using managed services is that maintenance and issues that come up, in many cases when we're trying to run our shops, issues that we deal with are typically, in previous shops, I would call them priority one and priority two issues. So is it down, or is there a serious issue that's causing a bunch of people to lose functionality in a particular part of the infrastructure or application environment? But resolving lower level issues maybe didn't have the manpower to do that. There were some cases where we couldn't, and those things languished. And where it came to maintenance, it was very difficult for us to do routine maintenance with the staff that we had because we were constantly under pressure to keep the staff to the size that it was, even though infrastructure was being added infinitesimally, or not infinitesimally, but infinitely. It was expanding. We'd get new projects that came through all of the time that expanded the application and the infrastructure footprint. But as far as maintaining existing systems, that sometimes went to the back burner. And so sometimes we paid the price. We were behind on patches and things like that. Well, those things are easily remediated with managed services because what a lot of organizations decide to do is they decide to take block and tackle tasks that frankly, they just bore the living daylights out of existing engineers, and they push those to the managed service provider who has basically a factory of scalable and regular procedures that they can just apply to the environment, and they can keep things up to date. So where it comes to continuous monitoring, well, it's good if you can set up monitoring, but how do you keep that up to date? How do you make sure that the baselines stay intact and make sure that as the performance in an infrastructure stack or an application stack, as that performance changes, the monitoring keeps up? Because these days, if you're going to monitor up down, that's great, but what you're really looking to do is you're looking to monitor performance for capacity issues and to proactively maintain systems to see, am I running into an issue here that is going to cause an issue, a problem that's perceptible by the end user? With the right kind of monitoring and with the right kind of predictive maintenance, those issues can be largely avoided. And so as you see that servers are running out of storage, or you see that they're running out of RAM, and you can see those things, and you can have monitoring tell you you're in the green, you're in the yellow, you're in the red, and then have a basically a program to go remediate those things, whether it's to build an automatic scale out of virtual machines or build an automatic scale out in the cloud. But all of those things are things that can be pushed to a managed service provider as opposed to trying to keep it internal. And we'll talk more about the reasons why that may make sense as we get further into our discussion here. And as we talked about, in many of the hospital systems that I work with on a day-to-day basis, patch management and keeping OSs up to date is a real nightmare. Like I said, they're under extreme pressure to keep the headcount in line. Where it comes to tools for managing the infrastructure, they may not be able to get the funding for that. So, patching, we don't want to patch a 200 or 2,000 server shop with manually going to apply updates or trying to use basic tools to do that. We need some additional infrastructure to get that done. But with a managed service provider, they have all of that already. All they do is they extend their process with some inputs from you with their tools, and they can build a program that even if you're behind on your patches, they can help bring that up to date over time. So I worked with one hospital system where the patches had gotten so far behind that it had become a really high priority item on their audit, their financial audit. It was an item that caused a qualified opinion. And so we had to go through a discussion with them about what would be the best way to bring them up to date. They were years behind on patches. And so we were able to help them to find a way to get that done. I told them, look, I've been in this situation before. I've had to deal with it. I took over a shop that had that issue. And so what we ended up having to do was start to replace the servers as opposed to trying to patch them. So you slowly replace the different platforms so that they're already patched and stay current as you sunset the older servers that are so far behind that really you can't catch them up. So managed service providers can provide that kind of advice and that kind of assistance under the remote engineering services that they provide for managing the infrastructure. Another benefit to having managed services to help with the infrastructure and with the IT in general is that managed services are scalable and flexible. So you may have had the experience of maybe you work in a hospital system where acquisitions are going on all the time. So maybe it's ambulatory practices that are being added, or hospitals that are being added and subtracted. I worked for Tenet Healthcare for a while, and we had acquisition and disposition activity going on all of the time, not only hospitals, but ambulatory practices by the dozens. And so we were using managed services because it was just as simple as me sending a request to say, I have a new ambulatory center coming online, and we have the standard package of services that we need to engage. And here's the timeline, and this is what we need to put up. Same with hospitals. When hospitals came on, there was just a playbook where we could send that information to the managed service provider, and they could run the playbook and be ready by the time the hospital is actually supposed to onboard, as opposed to not. So now if you flip that on its head and think about having to do that internally, think of the extra work that's required when you've got to go expand or even take on application stacks that were not in the environment before. And you may or may not be able to use the existing hardware that's there. And you may have to build additional infrastructure or additional cloud capacity. And it's a heavy lift, especially for bringing on a hospital. But when you're using a managed services provider, depending on the services that are subscribed to, that's not really the issue anymore. That's not really a problem, because you can really, with a request, with enough detailed information about the request and what's going to be happening, then you have the ability to just flex while you and your staff remain focused on strategic activities, not dealing with block and tackle activities like we're going to run a playbook to bring a new hospital on, or we're going to run a playbook to bring on a new ambulatory practice. So that flexibility really allows, in IT, the name of the game is to be able to be nimble, is a word that was used not so long ago. And to be able to say to the business says, hey, we're bringing this hospital on. And you say, yep, we got it. We got it taken care of. And it's not going to stress you out, or projects are not going to get behind because of it. That's a really nice place to be. And having been in those circumstances, I can tell you that that really is helpful. And then where it comes to resource allocation, where demand is required for resources, like we talked about, the managed service provider can allocate additional support, technical resources. So it's not just infrastructure and not just platforms that we're talking about adding capacity, but where it comes to people. So one of the constraints that I ran into in healthcare systems in the past was that I only had a finite number of people that were in my engineering group or my application group, and we would add a hospital, but we wouldn't add any IT staff. So, in the circumstance of a large hospital that's being added to the system, and you're expected to continue to maintain that whole infrastructure with either the existing group that you have, or maybe being able to bring on one or two people from the hospital system itself, it really puts you in a bind. And it used to put us in a bind to try to do it that way. So to be able to go to a managed service provider and they say, okay, here's the new cost. It's going to cost this much more. You're already in a contract. It's already a known quantity. The folks that are doing the acquisition can just add those numbers. It's something that's known. They can add it to their acquisition costs that they're going to capitalize. All of that makes it much simpler and more straightforward. And frankly, it makes it a little more reliable to make that adjustment and make that onboarding happen. Something else that managed service providers do typically, and this may not be something that is in use in your shop today, but more and more managed service providers use cloud technologies behind the scenes and scalable infrastructure to be able to scale very quickly. So they are able, let's say that you shift hosting of your infrastructure to a managed service provider, and you all agree that that's going to be a transition to them managing a cloud infrastructure as opposed to an on-prem infrastructure. Well, then the ability to flex and to scale becomes even more nimble and more quick, because in many cases you can spin up infrastructure in a matter of hours and preparing it, depending on the level of automation that's allowed and that's required, and depending on whether that new infrastructure that's needed is a known quantity or it has to be engineered. That can make expanding things much, much more quick and make them less painful to go through from a timing perspective. And it also prevents having to invest in physical infrastructure or to deal with capacity constraints where there's a long lead time on financial approvals and on the ability to actually get product. Because in many cases, not that long ago, it was taken, think about Cisco equipment. Cisco equipment was taking forever to get. I know, and for some of our customers, it was taking a year to get some equipment from Cisco. Not the case anymore. But in that kind of an environment, a managed service provider might have the capacity and the ability and the flexibility to add infrastructure without having to wait for that product cycle to occur. So scalability and flexibility is a key benefit of using managed services providers, and it just takes the headache out of it. What the managed service provider is running, especially if they're managing a cloud infrastructure for you, they can manage the capacity for you and the reliability, and you don't have to worry about that. Now let's talk for a minute about healthcare IT budgets and how it is that managed services can help to optimize IT budgets. So we'll talk about 5 key points here. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but we want to talk about some of these financial benefits that maybe you've considered, or it could be that you haven't considered before. And it's something that you look at it and you say, well, this is something worth considering. This can be sort of an eye opener to some folks that I've presented this to. They say, I hadn't considered that before. So let's talk about reduced labor costs for a minute. So you may say, well, okay, so if a managed service provider is going to do the same exact work that I'm doing internally, or they're even going to do more work than me, then how is it that that reduces the labor costs for me? So I'll just give you an example of Connection runs a knock sock managed service. And typically we're able to reduce costs. In a lot of cases, we reduce the cost of doing knock sock activities by about 75% in some cases. Now, how is it that we're able to do that when we're taking on the same work, or in our case, we're taking on additional work because we're enveloping the environment with monitoring, with actions that we're going to take, with remedial processes that we execute on the behalf of the customer? How is it we do all that? Well, what we've done is over the years, we have an artificial intelligence driven giant rule set and learning infrastructure that learns the environment and takes most of the actions to remediate issues and to escalate issues. Those all happen in an automated fashion. So instead of having 3 or 4 dozen people watch the infrastructure of one client, really the people that are involved are the folks who deal with exceptions that the automation doesn't deal with, because the automation will look sort of like the autopilot on an aircraft. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but if you're in an aircraft and you're flying, autopilot is fine with running the plane as long as things are stable. But there's a certain limit to which the autopilot will say, you know what, I'm out. I can't deal with these circumstances. I'm going to disable. And so then the pilot has to take control of the aircraft and fly it. The same thing goes on with automation. In our environment, what happens is issues that can't be solved by automation eventually tumble out of the system to a human being who says, what happened here? So they're going to do a couple of things. They're going to go and manually intervene to deal with the issue. And they're going to say, does it make sense for us to teach our artificial environment? Does it make sense for us to teach it about this particular circumstance? Is it rare and we should never expect it? Or is this something that we should catch and deal with? And so that's that input going back to the engine helps it to learn, and it incrementally increases the capacity of the system to deal with things on an automated basis. So where you might have 20 or 30 people in a larger organization dealing with knock and SOC activity, the people who touch that stack inside our organization may be 5 people, 3, 5, 7 people instead. So that means that the labor cost is much lower for a managed service provider to do that activity as opposed to doing it internally. It's a combination of tools, of automation, of blending people across customers so that they're working on issues that pop up. You don't have people with idle time who are just waiting for an issue to occur. All those things roll up into reduced labor costs. So in many cases, having a managed service provider provide a managed service for something that you're doing internally, it generally will give you better capacity, it'll give you additional capacity, and it's going to be a reduced cost to what you're doing today, depending on what the service is and depending on how it's engaged and how it's deployed. Something else that managed services provide that accountants love, and that is predictable expenses. So you enter into a contract with a managed service provider. You say, we're going to price this by, say, the number of devices that are in the environment or the number of users. And so then there's a fixed cost. The only variable is whatever that pricing is based on. You don't have to worry that some giant unexpected expense is going to roll along that everybody just says, how in the world are we going to pay for this? That you don't have to worry about that, because it's the problem of the managed service provider to deal with that. And this calls into question the art of the contract, right? You have to be careful when you're writing an agreement, and the managed service provider is going to be careful too. If they're a good managed service provider, as they go through the agreement that they're proposing, they will explain to you the ins and outs of it. And if there are going to be additional charges, that should be called out in the agreement. It should be clear that, for instance, if some licensing costs exceed a certain threshold, that's going to become a customer responsibility. There shouldn't be any surprises with the agreement. And most managed service providers do that, where they're very clear about exactly what's going to be in the environment, what you can expect. And so, because we don't want to have to come back and explain why you're going to have to get some charge that you didn't anticipate, because that one of the key things that we're advertising as managed service providers is predictability. And so that doesn't work if we're constantly floating extra charges. So predictable expenses are part of the cost efficiency and part of the benefit of using managed services. As we mentioned before, access to advanced technologies allows for something that maybe you don't have today. So let's say that you have some storage need or a virtualization need or some other infrastructure need that would cost a huge amount to implement from a capital perspective, for the infrastructure, for the software, for all of the support that it would need. It just is, in some cases, especially for small healthcare organizations, it is just unapproachable. It's just something that is outside the realm of possibility. But with a managed service provider, they typically already have that technology. They typically already have that capacity. And so that huge capital expenditure curve that has to be gone through when you're trying to manage that on your own, that typically goes away with managed services. It's all built into the service fee. It's not typical that you have to pay for licensing and infrastructure costs as well. That's all managed by the managed service provider. You're just paying a fee for the service itself. And typically, managed service providers want to be on the front end of advanced technology because that helps them to keep their headcount down internally. They gain additional capacity. They're able to make you happy as a customer, and they're able to provide the advanced technology that you may not be able to use or may not be able to acquire on your own. So that's a real benefit of managed services, and making sure that the managed service provider is providing cutting edge technology. And one of the things that you'll want to do is you're talking to a managed service provider in a particular subject area, talk with them about where they are as far as their development of capacity and their roadmap going forward. Because in some cases, a managed service provider is going to be able to tell you, okay, in 2024, we intend to do this. Over the next 2 or 3 years, we intend to do these things. We see this technology coming down the pike, and we intend to implement that. That's a sign of a healthy managed service provider. If you talk to a managed service provider about a particular service that you're looking to subscribe to, and they cannot describe their roadmap forward, that is a problem. They need to be able to describe their strategy if they have one. And if they don't have one, or if they're just doing catch as catch can, that's a problem. That is something that should weigh heavily on your decision if you're going to use that managed service provider or not. So that's a question to ask: is what is your roadmap forward for whatever that, and even if it's a canned application, for instance, that a managed service provider is providing for you, ask them how they intend to improve support, and how they intend to, what value are they adding if they're providing an application that already has a roadmap to the application. What value are they going to add going forward? And it's not so much that you're looking to critique their strategy going forward, although when you hear it, you'll be able to decide whether you think that's a good strategy going forward or not. What's more important is, do they have a strategy to improve their service, to be able to implement advanced technology or not? So that's a key differentiator when you're talking to the managed services providers. And I've talked to both. I've talked to managed service providers that can give me strategy as the day goes along. They can talk at a top level about it. They can go deeper into it. Some of them can go as deep as you want to go. If you have questions, and especially if that happens to be your area of expertise, they should be able to go to the bottom of the well with you to have that discussion with you. Cost efficiency involves necessarily improved general efficiency of services. So IT operations are complex, and that complexity drives cost. And so where a managed services provider can streamline operations, streamline management, increase operational efficiency, reduce downtime, all of those things are going to be beneficial, because even if a managed service provider is doing the work, what you don't want is a managed service provider that's going to have issues that drive labor inside your organization. I've seen folks that use a managed service provider and then they end up having to add contractors to deal with issues that fall out of the managed service provider. You don't want that to happen. So it's a question to ask when you're talking to a managed service provider. The good ones will not have that going on because they're motivated to do this, right? To increase operational efficiencies, because they are looking to lower their own internal costs. So they need to maintain a high level of service, good reliability, efficiency, but they need to drive lower costs on their side of the equation. And so if they have a plan to do that, and if they're able to execute on that, that makes them a great managed service provider. And we talked earlier about scalability. This scalability, really what that goes to, like we've talked about before, being able to scale goes to being able to not have you as an organization have to go through capital expenditures and additional operational expense, potentially even headcount that has to be added. The managed service can just provide that for a flat fee. And as you expand, it just ratchets up the flat fee, because the fee is typically driven by, like I said, number of machines, number of nodes on a network, number of users. That all goes to the cost efficiency of using managed services. And we talked about this before, and we'll just emphasize it one more time. Having predictable spending. I know in the IT shops that I managed, and we ended up working, it seems like that we were working every day with our accounting folks, because IT was such a large spend and a very complex spend between the headcount and the licensing and all the different things that went into the expense. To be able to say, well, our entire network management is this fee, and it only flexes to the number of nodes I've got on the network, that just took a lot of work out of my job as a director, because I didn't have to deal with a bunch of one-off expenses, and I didn't have to deal with unforeseen expenses coming along. And I could just check the service amounts that came in on the invoices, verify that they were correct with the node count that I had on hand, and authorize that and send it to accounting and give them the information they needed to allocate that properly. It really cut down the complexity, and it really saved me time to be able to do that, as opposed to dealing with it internally, because the accountants that I worked with at the various hospital systems, they were under a large number of regulations and accounting processes and procedures that really drove a lot of complexity that existed when we had internal IT, but not so much when we had outsourced or managed services. And the spending, like we talked about, because it's generally unit-based pricing or unit-based service charges, that scales with the growth. So we didn't have to spend a bunch of money to get ahead of growth. We could just add services as we needed them, and it kept us from getting in a huge headache. And it kept us from getting in a cash flow problem too, because the smaller hospitals that I worked for, we had real cash flow constraints. I couldn't go to the board and say, I need $3 million for a new storage platform. I couldn't do it. I had to go and do something else, which typically meant managed services for me. One of the big benefits of using a managed service too is that you can focus on your organization, healthcare, and then from the managed service provider, you can get their support. You have less administrative burden, like we were just talking about. It sweeps away a lot of security and compliance issues that you don't have to deal with anymore. Just for a second, think about audits. Imagine if you're somebody that mainly has internal IT and an internal IT shop. Imagine or just think about what you have to go through at audit time, especially if you're a publicly traded organization. The pages and pages and pages of details that you have to provide, and all the information about the environment and all your testing procedures. Imagine being able to pack that up and send it to the managed service provider and say, fill this out. And then you get it back and you check it for accuracy or for if you have questions. Imagine that. That's a huge benefit of using a managed service because they are on the hook. And generally in their agreement, it says that they are required to be compliant and that they are required to have a clean audit. So those are some things, those are real benefits as well to being able to focus on your business, which is supporting the healthcare organization, as opposed to that block and tackle. We also said that we were going to talk about reducing turnover, improving staff retention, which is a real challenge these days. It's the number of qualified people in the job pool is shrinking. We used to say several years ago that the unemployment rate was such that in IT, we'd kind of gotten down to the people that were available were unemployable. And I don't know if that's the case now. I don't think so. But you may get into those situations where you'd be hard pressed to recruit somebody into new positions, and you don't want to lose anyone. So how does staff burnout get alleviated? First of all, by using a managed service. Well, the strategy that a lot of organizations use, that I used in the past, was that I sent my dirty work to the managed service provider. So the stuff that my engineers did not want to deal with, like patching, like routine network monitoring, routine incident management and remediation, that we sent that all to the managed service provider. And they were on the hook to handle that. So the net effect is the engineers are dealing with project work. They're building new stuff. They're not having to deal with maintaining the existing infrastructure because that is subbed out to the managed service provider. Plus, that is a commodity. Those are repetitive processes that are well known. They're not anything that's novel. We kept the novel stuff internal, things that were unique to us, that were strategic, that were project-based. We kept that internal. So something else that's a benefit that alleviates staff burnout is not having to have as much on-call or after-hours work. Imagine that you have engineers that are answering calls all night long about various network issues or various server issues that are going on, various application issues. With a managed service provider, the managed service provider is only going to contact you if something very seriously wrong is going on that you need to know about. So it cuts the calls to, especially your engineers and your application analysts, it cuts that way down to when they get a call at night, it's a real problem. They're not being called about mundane things or something that somebody else should have been able to solve. They're not being contacted about that. So that really is part of alleviating staff burnout because they're not dealing with the 1,000 pinpricks of death that they used to deal with when a managed service provider is managing the environment. Also, staff is given the ability to develop their careers. They have the ability to access the specialists that are with the managed service provider. They may participate in some complex problem resolution or construction with the managed service provider who is applying their experts to a particular infrastructure or application implementation. So they are able to develop professionally as well as they work with the managed service provider because they are benefiting from the expertise that the managed service provider has built up. So it's very important to be able to have people feel like they're advancing, that they have a path to go forward, and that they're not dealing with 1,000 pinpricks of death. Those two things really reduce turnover in our experience and in our observation dealing with healthcare organizations. So let me just go to the questions and answers here to see if there are any.
Yeah, I don't have anything in the Q&A as of yet, Chance. Everybody, we do have a few minutes if you'd like to put a question in the Q&A, or if you'd like to use the raise your hand feature, and I can unmute you if you have a question for Chance.
And what happens to me is that I always think of the questions after the webinar is over. So about 10 minutes later, I say, oh, I should have asked that. I think the presentation is coming to you that has my contact information in it, and you're
Yeah.
welcome to contact me anytime. So my role with Connection is such that what I do can even benefit non-customers, right? I act in an advisory capacity. So if you have questions or if there's something that I can help you with, it doesn't mean you have to use Connection for managed services or for anything, right? I'm happy to answer those questions just based on some of the work I've previously done. And if I happen to know an answer to a question, I'm happy to provide it. So feel free to contact me anytime.
There's also, in our exit survey, there is a place to also put those questions in for Chance, or just to even indicate that you would like your information shared with Chance so he can reach out to you as well if you do have any questions. So there is lots of ways to contact you, Chance, which is perfect. Well, I do want to thank you, Chance, for presenting to our membership today and being a premier sponsor with Connection. And I do want to remind everyone that I will be sending the CP Himss credit along with the PDF, a link to his presentation today. And like I said, when you exit and take that survey, if you want any more information as well, I can connect you with Chance. And just to remind everyone, we do have a in-person meeting tomorrow night. Networking session at our After Dark in downtown Boston. It's Navigating Your Healthcare Career in the Age of AI, and that registration is still open. So if anyone would like to network in person tomorrow evening with New England Himss, you can register for that event. So thank you very much, Chance, and we appreciate your time today. And I will follow up with you with any survey questions. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you very much, everyone.